Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming. My name's Roger Duffy. I'm with SOM, and I'd like to welcome you tonight to this beautiful room. I've never been up here before. I've been in the Strand thousands of times. Didn't know this existed, but beautiful, beautiful venue to have this panel discussion tonight. Tonight we're celebrating an important book, we think, called The Future of Public Space. This is the second book in our series of SOM thinkers. The first one was The Future of the High Rise. And we do lots of publications at SOM. We do monographs, and we do journals, and we do engineering manuals, and lots of things like that. This is a special kind of project, The Future of Public Space, where we invite outside experts into our world, our design world, and to hypothesize about important topics that relate to, we hope, the public at large, in this case, the public realm that we all share together. Tonight, we have a distinguished set of panelists that we hope will discuss some of the topics in the book, but also they all work with the public realm in one way or the other, so I'm sure they'll personalize it based on their own experiences. But this is an important topic, and hopefully this discussion will evolve in ways that we haven't foreseen in the book, and create new awarenesses for us all since we share this important resource. I would like to, before I introduce our moderator, thank the panel for adjusting their schedules from an earlier snow incident to be here with us tonight. So thank you all and welcome. And also I'd like to thank the great Amy Gill, who's the editor of this journal and has a great labor of love, this passion she has for producing this great book, and she's here somewhere tonight. But I'd like to acknowledge her as well. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to one of the writers that participated in the Future of Public Space, but also the moderator for tonight's panel, Ben Davis. So Ben.
Thank you. Feel free to applaud for Ben Davis. Yeah, so I am one of the essayists in this excellent collection, The Future of Public Space. And that is not exactly what we're going to be talking about tonight. It's an excellent collection, has, if I do say so myself, some great contributors. But what we have for you tonight is something a little bit broader and in a way more practical and of the moment, because we have four very exciting and important people who are thinking through the practical questions of public space, as I'm sure many of you here know. So I'll tell you exactly how the evening is going to unfold, which is that I will introduce each of these, our four panelists in turn, and let them talk a little bit about how they view the problem of public space in the present in relationship to their practice. And then I have here a selection of questions on the theme, and hopefully we'll get them to debate the stakes of this important question as night unfolds. And then towards the end, depending on how things are going, I'll throw it open to you so that you can weigh in with whatever questions are on your mind or larger themes that you want to draw out from what we're talking about. Sound good? That's what I like to hear. So we'll start at the far end in alphabetical order. Our first participant is Olalekan Jeyifous. He has spent over a decade creating large-scale artwork for a variety of public, private, and institutional spaces. Most recently, he has completed commissions for the Chicago Transit Authority and the Opa-locka Community Development Corporation, and a 50-foot-tall sculpture for the 2017 Coachella Valley Music and Arts Festival, and 4 large sculptures in Cleveland's Public Square. So, Olalekan, how do you think about public space in relationship to your practice and what you do?
Okay, I just want to thank everyone for coming out tonight and my fellow panelists. Public space is always kind of featured in my work, particularly the fact I'm a visual artist, but I'm very much inspired by, my architectural background, and I create sort of speculative, fantastical reimaginings of space. Sometimes dystopian, sometimes heterotopian, sometimes a more sort of positive outlook and spin. And the scale moves from, you know, very large macro scale to very much on the ground. And especially in terms of like the public art projects that I've started to do. So then I've started considering public art in its relation to public spaces and where public art can be and what kind of public spaces can be activated by public art. So for me, it's just an ongoing thing, pretty much across my particular artistic trajectory.
Excellent. Our next participant, one in from Olalekan, is Damon Rich, a designer, visual artist, and partner in Hector. He previously served as planning director and chief urban designer for the city of Newark and is the founder of the Center for Urban Pedagogy. So, Damon, same question for you. How do you think about the question of public space in relationship to your practice?
Well, also good to be here and to be here with some excellent colleagues. If it's all right, I'm just kind of curious to know who we're looking at. Are people here artists? All right. Are you architects? All right. Are you urban planners? Are you real estate developers? Doctors? Anything interesting we should know about? I guess maybe it'll come out later. Well, I would just quickly say that I guess coming from a pretty traditional architecture education where we spent most of our time looking at Le Corbusier and Loos and some pretty canonical figures, it was a real shock to start to see public space as a battlefield, which I think first most shockingly came into focus working for the New York City Parks Department after school. And the quick story I'll share is one day the councilman showed up with a group of softball players who usually played softball at this park in Queens. And in their hand, they had this design that they said was going to solve the problems of this park. And as they talked, it became really clear that their problem was that some people over the years had started to play soccer in the outfields, because it was 4 softball fields with the outfields facing each other. Most of those people were Spanish speakers, you know, Latin people of various backgrounds. And this had become an increasing conflict. And so their proposal, which they had drawn out and gotten this official political support for, simply proposed to take every softball field and rotate it 180 degrees. So the backstops would be in the middle of the space that was formerly open and green and available for soccer. And we started to call it the metal in the middle plan. And as someone who had thought initially of architecture as a conceptual activity of the mind, the fact that something as simple as a softball backstop could be used in a battle between groups and political interests and classes is something that I'm glad that I learned early. All right. No, we all have our own.
Okay. One seat nearer to me is Oana Stanescu, who works in architecture, design, and education. Prior to establishing her eponymous studio, she was the co-founding partner of Family, a New York-based design practice, and one of the designers of the Plus Pool, the world's first water-filtering floating pool. She currently teaches at Harvard and at Cooper Union. Oana?
Hi, everyone. Good to see everyone both in line with me and you guys. Well, for me, my introduction, in a way, my kind of biggest awareness of public space came when I first came to the States. Because coming from Europe, it was where basically public space is how you understand and navigate a city. Once I got to the States, I understood that in Europe you take those things for granted, and here I had to start searching for public life and public space, kind of try to understand it differently. So to put it in a really interesting perspective, I think in many ways, I'm trying through all my work to touch on, like, to confront the issue of public space. No matter what you do as an architect, you are touching on public space. You cannot avoid the issue, whether it happens at a minimal level or your project is all about that. But I think that awareness becomes crucial and is super important, and I always try to keep an eye on it.
Okay, and last but not least, and nearest to me, last but nearest to me, is that me? Do I need to, further away? Yeah. Okay. Bad omen, Claire. Nearest to me is Claire Weisz, a founding partner of WXY, a firm known for community-centered approach to architecture, urban design and planning, and a co-founder and executive director of Design Trust for Public Space. She has lectured and taught widely, most recently as the 2017 Portman Visiting Critic at the Georgia Tech School of Architecture, and she just won the AIA New York's Medal of Honor. So Claire, same question for you, public space in relationship to your work.
Well, first off, like all of my colleagues, it's super fun to know we all survived the snow day, and we actually managed to reconstitute ourselves up here and to kind of just be talking about this, because I'll go back to memory lane. And Damon, you probably know this, that and it's true when you first started CUP, but the impetus for Andy Woodner and I to like go, oh my God, what are we gonna do, was that the word public space used to be a dirty word. And at least from a point of view of architecture, even artists who were really like, in a way, banished from it. And architects were not supposed to design anything in the public realm that was particularly compelling or good looking, because it might look expensive and offend various politicians. And even worse, it might cause people to hang out there beyond required hours. And I like, so reflecting on that, and both the fact that this book exists, but also that recently, after Andy and I decided that we were not going to give the Design Trust the Founders Syndrome, we thought we'll invest in a kind of research project, at which we ended up doing a bunch of focus groups on, was there a public space movement? Is there a public space movement? Do we have like, is it still happening, or was it over? And you know, and we ended up calling it, and again, there's no final answer, but we ended up calling it Sharing the City. And so my mindset is still like, are we at a moment in time where this dialogue is heated and we're talking about whether the public space is a changing idea, a contested idea? And I thought that was really, it's kind of fun to be at this moment and be thinking that we really all have to talk about this, because otherwise public space would, like the international style, you know, when our movements will be we'll just see watered down versions of whatever that was, and years later people will blame us for having created something that in a sense seems defunct, and I think that would be too bad.
That's a perfect lead-in for where I want to start the conversation between you, which is that the name of the book that we're here to talk around, really, is The Future of Public Space. So I want to start with the question of the future. You know, what is the future? Our audience presumably is here looking to navigate the future. But so what do you see as being the pressures on the concept of public space? Now, you talked a little bit about that, Damon, and you talked about the coming out of historical research on this topic. But I'm very interested to know what you think the evolving pressures on the concept of public space are.
I like how we're who's first? All right, I go. Well, I don't know if the pressures are any different than they were in the past, in the sense that the primary pressures on public space are political and have always been. And you guys touched slightly on it, and I think that's important to remember. And politics have many different shades or variants to them too, but I think the essence of public space is that it needs to be free and generous. And the moment it stops being that, the moment it starts being prescriptive, or there's a price to pay, which can happen through many different ways, through very subliminal ways for that matter, all in the name of certain political things, then it becomes really dangerous. And what I mean by that is, you know, I think Rem said it recently, that in the name of that our so-called smart cities, like we like to call them, are in essence fairly dumb, because they're all centered around the idea of security, comfort, and sustainability, which by all means are very important elements, but they should be built in. They shouldn't be a goal in themselves. They shouldn't be the driver, but they should be kind of let's say, things that are by default incorporated in public space. Meaning the point of public space is to bring people together, to foster communities, to question who we are as people, what our condition is, what do we stand for. And the moment the space becomes about something else, it becomes dangerous really quickly.
Do you guys agree that it's the same as it ever was? You know, there are pressures, but they are the same political pressures from time immemorial?
Well, Claire just worked on Astor Place, which I was really curious about now that it's kind of in the ground, right? Growing up.
Well, I think that what's great about working in places that have deep histories, whether it's histories of protest, histories of change, is that in working on Astor Place for one administration, which was about one thing, right? You know, putting pedestrians first, green infrastructure, you know, putting things that, you know, extra space for cars that didn't need to be there. There's that's a kind of was never a priority. You look at older pictures of Astor Place, even when the Second Avenue elevated was there, it wasn't, it allowed freedom of people, but it really was totally not, people accepted a lot of things. And then, you know, for a while, so that I think there has been a kind of change in not letting the car dictate everything. So that's, I think, we hope we're not going back from there. What I would say though, and if anyone's familiar with the Tile project in Astor Place, it was a guerrilla kind of activist project by Bob Powers. Who, I always want to say Steve Powers, but Steve Powers is a different artist. But who during the 70s, as a kind of, you know, continuing, did these guerrilla dedication encrusting lamp poles with tiles. And what's interesting that happened is locally both the Poetry Society and everyone kind of said, I know we're going to kind of moving around streets and giving more space, but like, what about this project? We can't just like throw it out. And so we spent as much time working on the like other curb logistics as just sitting down and going, okay, this pool is here, and then figuring out how to put them in a yard and how to bring them back and how to put them exactly where they were or not. And like the debate of how that was going to happen was interesting because it allowed a kind of dialogue of both loss to happen, time, but also an admission that that wasn't considered art because no one commissioned and asked for it. And I think that's a really crux, and your article talked a little bit about it, but the whole issue of free and generous also has to do with who pays for it is the real new dialogue with this discussion. Mm-hmm. And what if you should be able to do things that no one is paying for, but what does that mean?
Right, that's presumably part of the definition of public space is the public use of the space. Yeah. Damon or Olalekan?
Interesting thing for me, especially thinking of the anecdote that you just told, you know, between sort of the softball players and what I imagine was kind of like the established community and how they were utilizing their spaces in a particular way. You see that a lot in neighborhoods that are transforming very rapidly through development. And so that then, you know, public space has always definitely been contested, but you know, in terms of just where I am right now, seeing it firsthand, living in Crown Heights, Brooklyn for 17 years, seeing it transform, seeing the way communities will respond to sort of large public, projects in their communities that don't seem to consider them, they don't seem to consider the longtime residents. And then understanding that those sort of public developments that on the outset seem altruistic will then invite kind of investment that will inevitably end up pushing them out, you know. So for me, I see a lot of like, and even China Miéville, is that how you say his name? He's one of my favorite authors, I just never know how to say his name. Even his short story, just really exacerbating the notion of how contested these spaces are between the political ideologies, between communities, to the point where space in hell and heaven and the kind of bridge between purgatory in these worlds is now even more, you know, even like the next threshold in that kind of contested space. That is for me is what is kind of like my more ever-present idea of kind of how, you know, public spaces is being considered, particularly neighborhoods, how they transition, and exactly who the public, you know, who these particular projects are specifically for. And, you know, to your anecdote, it becomes a very sort of complicated thing.
Yeah, if one goes to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., there's a room at the top of the permanent installation where they talk about space. They talk about the history of urban space, and one of the things they talk about the urban crisis and, you know, white flight, disinvestment, and then what really struck me is that it ended, that video presentation ends, is like, and now in the 21st century, communities of color face a new problem, which is communities that were once abandoned are now unaffordable. And I was blown away by that. I was like, wow, that's the official narrative now, is that there's this punctuation mark, and what were the problems of the past are not the problems of the present. Damon, or Oana, do you want to say something? Or you've actually worked in Newark and so on, so I...
Actually, indeed, and lived. I mean, yeah, in DC, I mean, right? I just got that old Parliament record, Chocolate City. I check it out, recommended. But I heard somebody crack the other day that now it's more like chocolate chips, right? I mean, for me, I mean, listening to what you were saying about Crown Heights, connected to what, I guess, Claire, you were talking about, you know, curbs, right? That, you know, that you could write a whole set of footnotes, I bet. I mean, I would love for you to give us that tour. Maybe not tonight, but, you know, once it warms up, you know, telling us about how every indentation of the curb, whether it's a drop curb that's level with the pavement, or whether when the car maybe comes up to the pavement, it has to actually go up. So there's a difference between the space of the street and the space of the sidewalk, that there's this like micro politics, right? Of like where the concrete or the steel or whatever got like put in the place. But then it ramps up. You know, I mean, in our studio at Hector, we have ended up, even though we're coming from architecture backgrounds, doing a lot of work in public spaces and urban design and parks. And certainly those are places where these conflicts really come to the surface. But I think like what you're saying, they're really just metonyms. We can use words like that because we're at the Strand, right? Right? Yeah. A small thing standing for a big thing, right? You know, it's really just a metonym for the overall city, right? Which has this public quality about it, right? I mean, if you know, go back in urban planning for a long time, if you were rich, you owned a lot of land, like no one could tell you what to do with the land. You know, as soon as people were living closer together, like that wasn't like so free and easy anymore, because you were maybe enjoying, you know, your dinner, and then someone opens up like a pig slaughterhouse next door. And so that's where things like zoning, you know, it's more complicated than that, but you know, things where people insisted that there's things that we have to make decisions about together, right? If we're gonna live this close together, Lord knows, right? And so then you start to look at, well, how are we making those decisions? I mean, I just was looking at these crazy news clips of Inwood. I mean, Inwood is the latest rezoning. I don't know if we have like zoning nerds in the house, you know, watching the latest couple years of what we called it with my students, Zaquima, because it was zoning for quality and affordability and mandatory inclusionary housing. I'm not gonna go all into that right now, but these basic questions of democracy, I think, even though they maybe come to the surface in these public spaces specifically and concretely, I think unless they're connected to those deeper questions of power and decision making and what we think is an acceptable way to make a decision, then they're not, I think, gonna be serving us into the future.
Can I sort of posit a kind of theory of why, you know, your experience at the Parks Department and how we all usually do things is maybe of the present, but we hope not of the future. So, you know, people admit the public spaces are parks, right? So you're a landscape architect, you go design a park. Or you're Damon and you design the waterfront. Or you're an architect or a landscaper, you design this. Or you're an artist, you get to install a piece of art in a space. But the truth is that, and you try and talk to community residents, you set up processes, you have this dialogue, right? But the truth is, if I talk to the football coach who's been like killing himself in Commodore Barry Park to get, you know, the team together, get lights on, you know, get something going there, what you really want to be is part of the bigger discussion about why your kids have a hard time going to Brooklyn Bridge Park and why Brooklyn Bridge Park has, you know, lights and you guys don't. And so the opportunity, you know, I say this like trying to do these connectivity plans, the opportunity is to take things, you know, instead of the high line of the future is taking something like that and saying, actually, forget your park plan. It's about this connecting to this, and we are gonna, there's gotta be this dialogue where people get connected things, and their park is trading this with this park and this, and I think that gets into the doing something about the tragedy of the commons, but now, as opposed to when at a certain point the sheep went crazy and people didn't want to graze their sheep collectively.
The capitalists went crazy. Not the
Okay.
sheep.
That is true. But what are you saying? That won't be a problem in the future because
No, I'm
you
saying
think we're gonna
that's
work it out?
really.
That's the problem.
I think that's why having artists and architects and transportation planners and everyone go, I think there's something missing here, guys. The something missing, I think, is the admission that just because you get given in public space, unlike buildings, and whether you're an artist or whoever, an architect, a musician, a dancer, when someone tells you to color in the lines, you go, yeah, it's public space. I know I'm not supposed to color in. Like, there's an admission already that you're outside the lines. That's the whole point. I don't know. I think that's what a lot of people share in this discussion, knowing it flows. Like, just like the same discussion about water. Like streets, you can't just say, that street stops here. Actually, that street, whether it's Lexington, keeps going. So you got to keep talking to everyone else on 4th Avenue. I don't know. I think that's really where it gets interesting.
But I guess so. I helped edit this catalog for Rem Koolhaas, the elements of architecture, and there is a graph in it. There's a section on the toilet in it, and there is a graph in it where it plots public restrooms in New York versus Starbucks, right? Which is like the publicly operated restrooms is like a flat line down, and Starbucks are a straight line up. And it's essentially like that function has been de facto privatized. You know, the city's not going to do it anymore. We're gonna turn that function over to private spaces. So I mean, is public space that's where I see the frontier problem evolving towards? Like, is public space, you know, where it's at? I mean, are the economic realities such that you can contest for it?
I mean,
the winds are blowing in the direction.
I think it depends on which part of the city you're talking about in many ways. In the sense that I got a way deeper or different understanding of public space in New York when I moved to Harlem. I've only been there for 3 years, but I've witnessed a lot of what was mentioned earlier, in the sense that people inhabit the space in a different manner. People hang out on the stoops and they play dice, and that's where life happens. Or people just drive up and they spend time in their car, which I never witnessed downtown. And all of a sudden, the public space became kind of like just to use cliches, an urban living room of sorts. But the tensions that I felt were there were that of gentrification, where I walk my dog with my dog's best friend, and you know, on Memorial Day weekend or something like that, the Morningside Park is booming. People are doing barbecues, they have dance-offs, it's amazing. And then the person who I walked, my dog's friend's owner, sorry, he's complaining that the noise, the smell, it's all outrageous, and I have to explain to him in a way like, this is community. These are families having a cook-off and a dance-off, and there's nothing more amazing or more beautiful. You should be jealous, if anything. And you know, the minor discomfort that your dog is having right now, which, you know, he's living in a townhouse with a garden, is minor compared to what you're witnessing, right? It's like kind of crazy. And I had to actually explain that to a 60-year-old white person, that what they're witnessing was actually beautiful and amazing. So I'm saying that because, yes, there is that issue of privatization which happens in certain levels, but then at a very kind of intimate private level, there's just this direct face-off where dialogue is missing, to your point, and worlds are just clashing in a brutal way. And it's we all know it, we all see it, you know. And just on my block, in just the 3 years that I've been there, there's 3 townhouses were converted into condos and the stoops are gone. And that's painful. That's painful to watch for the city. Like you know what I mean? It shows how things are being changed in a really dramatic way, and each pretends they're doing it individually, but it's a big, large-scale change. Sorry, this has nothing to do with your question, probably.
No, it does. I guess my question is, for you as practitioners, where's that conversation happen? I mean, Damon, community development is your, I think we have some great photos here of some of these workshops you've done.
Well, the way that, you know, I think that those issues oftentimes come up in practice in like a day-to-day way, you know, is the question of raising expectations. You know, at the most simple level, you guys were talking about bathrooms, right? We're working on a park now that's in southeast Philadelphia. It was built about 100 years ago, hasn't been touched too much since by the city in any kind of official way. Different people, as they've lived in the neighborhood, have really altered it to their own needs. Now there's some like DIY volleyball courts, which are great, but when it rains, it's a big mud pit, and even when it doesn't rain, big clouds of smoke come over to all the elder people are like playing cards and gambling, but they don't want to move away from there because they don't want the little kids on the playground to see them gambling. So it's a whole evolved ecosystem, and of all these people, you know, it's like 13,000 people in the neighborhood. You know, some of the community organizations there, and there's a whole coalition of them, did a survey, and the number one thing that people would like to see in their park is a bathroom, right? It's not rocket science. You know, right now, some people, you know, either have to run home, or if they have, you know, less hang-ups, then they might, you know, just use, you know, go in the park. So that has then kicked off a whole series of discussions with the Parks Department, right? Because, well, you know, there might be, you know, first questions of capital budgets, like, you know, where's the money going to come from to build something like that? And, you know, those things can be more expensive than you might guess if you're not in the business. But then the much bigger question is operational. You know, in this particular case, are they going to be able to extend the seasonal worker there, who's, you know, there 9 months out of the year, like through the winter, to be able to keep an eye on it, keep it clean, et cetera? Or are there other ways to work that? So finding that kind of resource, no matter where it's coming from. You know, thank goodness you can like sneak into a Starbucks and go to the bathroom, right? I mean, you know, I'm not mad at that. But, you know, especially in a season today where, you know, somehow there's money to build like a crazy looking hive of staircases in Hudson Yards. But there's like certainly like not money for a whole list of other things, you know. And it's interesting right now, if people don't know, this thing called participatory budgeting that y'all have in New York City and we're all jealous of in Jersey. Voting is happening either right now or imminently. And just to see the list of things that people are like scrapping by to get, you know, $200,000 for a AC for the school or some shelves, you know, for the library is an amazingly humbling thing to be like, why the hell can't we get this done? Like, don't we live in a democracy?
Can we talk about that part in the book about Tilted Arc?
Sure,
Kind of like that whole.
Do you want me to summarize?
Yeah, can you? Because I think it's just really apropos to the kind of discussion you started.
What fires your imagination about it?
Well, you know,
regard
the
to this?
whole thing between is the art in the public room, or is the public room the art? And
Is it art in the public room or the public room the art? Like, you summarize it, and then I'll.
so, anyways, Tilted Arc, you know, amongst some people, the big Richard Serra sculpture that got hauled off, you know, and there's been two other landscape architects, Martha Schwartz and now Michael van Valkenburg, big amounts of money redesigning the same space that replaced
Federal Plaza.
Federal Plaza, Tilted Arc. And what I think is really interesting thinking about now, that kind of the design, the art, and what started with an artist making one move, which was actually a really clear move, and the excuse being people didn't like it, and everything that's come after it is people will like it better. It's really interesting because in a lot of cases, like with participatory budgeting, only some people are ever asked whether they like it or not. And I think, and it's when you think about things that happen, sometimes they're not things that people like right away. Sometimes they're things that make you think. Other times they allow a discussion to happen between people. They're not always, you know, kind of everyone's happy. And I think that's actually the important part about public space, is to allow those discussions to happen, not to just say that everyone has to agree to do X. And so when you think about where it's going, right, and whether you love or hate the Heatherwick thing, the truth is it's totally privatized space, despite the huge amount of public dollars. And it was decided by one person that that was their gift to the city, and not even a federal program with tax dollars that Tilted Arc was. So I think Tilted Arc gets a bad name, but in fact it was art was part of a kind of publicly funded program then. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, Tilted Arc became a sort of symbol in, it's sort of interesting now to read the debates around it, where 1989, it's the beginning of the Bush 1 years, and it really just becomes a symbol for people of, the attack on it becomes for the art community this symbol of authoritarian populism, right? You know, it's not a pleasant work of art, it's just a big metal wall in people's way, and so it becomes a really convenient way to demonize the idea of a certain kind of modernist avant-gardism, and a certain kind of public art, really, this of art that's kind of deposited for people, and so I think tremendous amount of emotional investment in that work of art. An interesting thing about it is that out of that controversy around it came a lot of the stuff about participatory public art, where they really made it, the ideas of like, we have to talk to people about these things before we just deposit them, came a little bit out of that controversy. So it just becomes an interesting hinge point in history. What do you guys think about the question of consulting of I guess that gets to my second question, which is who's the public in public art? You know, how do you think about the public? Because there are publics, right? There are the city's been going around for a couple of years talking about this new cultural plan where they're talking to hundreds of people or thousands of people with all these open sessions. But in the end, when you look at what they actually propose, it becomes really clear that they're trying to serve everybody. And what you get is kind of something that serves nobody. Because in some ways, the interests of small business owners are opposed to the interests of activists fighting different kinds of battles and so on.
Skateboarders versus, business. Like, I think it's a good question.
Skateboarders, yes. So if you guys just weighed in on the skateboarding question.
I'm all for skateboarders. I never understand why people block them. But anyway, sidebar. Yesterday I ended up by chance watching a video on The Atlantic, and it was about trans and gender non-conforming swimming club. And it was about people in the UK that just ended up forming their little swimming club and use a public pool to have their swimming hour, which they call in a safe space. And it was just so beautiful how they were describing it, because it was their first chance to face the world in the most intimate way, in a very physical way. And I don't want this to be self-serving in the area of swimming and pools. But it was quite insightful and beautiful, and it was so specific in a way, because public space doesn't just mean public parks. I think that's just one minor part actually of the public space that we're inhabiting, but we're also talking about streets obviously are public, but there's public libraries, there are public swimming pools, public programs that are equally important. So I do hope that within the last years we were able to open our minds and eyes a little bit more to the nuances of what public means, and we're able to have dialogues that where they're still difficult sometimes we weren't able to have 20 years ago. This doesn't answer your question in any means, but I thought it was a very beautiful video. You should try to watch it.
Publics.
That's actually a good point. You mentioned kind of expanding the sort of perception of what public space is. We seem to, in my experience, in just a kind of observational understanding, people believe it's parks and plazas and promenades. And public spaces is actually, whether it's commercial or privatized space, it's every single thing outside of your door. As soon as you leave, you're in a public space. And that includes, you know, the way the streets are coded, the way you navigate through them, you know, the different types of transportation that interact, every aspect of signage, the way the signage looks, all of that is definitely public space. And so what that does then, it also kind of opens up a different way of looking at what sort of interventions artists, architects, planners, et cetera, can now consider, you know, ground opportunities for defining public space. Instead of thinking of kind of like large flagship, you know, projects, more kind of intimate, smaller, sudden, looking at underutilized spaces, looking at temporary spaces. I know for myself, being an artist, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, I did a residency with them. They opened up, I don't know if it's still running, but they had the Swing Space program, which is down in the financial district, and where they partnered with commercial businesses to use storefronts when they're in between commercial tenants. Because, you know, you go down the financial district, it's, you know what I mean? It's like, it's depressing after a certain point, you know? Yeah, especially the strange sort of turnaround of commercial storefront spaces. So then opening those up to emerging artists who want to test different performances or ideas or installations in a public audience, and then also giving, you know, daytime, you know, folks who inhabit the space in the daytime kind of sudden opportunities to stumble upon artwork and, you know, those different kind of spaces. So while there's a lot of, you know, the main sort of contested kind of idea where we really look at, you know, transforming whole neighborhoods and whole communities, but then there's also sort of smaller opportunities for interventions, you know, abandoned lots and sides of buildings and alleyways that aren't occupied, and you get into things like food deserts and how these spaces can both be appropriated not only for a kind of fun public space, but kind of a functional public space that could possibly, you know, bring fresh produce to communities, you know, anything like a book repository, information, you know, just different ways of thinking of kind of activating spaces and interventions that can be created.
Yeah, it strikes me, well, I'm interested to know if you guys agree with that. It strikes me that there is a way that kind of the narrative of public space is kind of being compressed to these more guerrilla, temporary, fleeting, pop-up kind of things. And I wonder if that's an advance, or, you know, there was an article about this in the New York Times sort of on the endless question of, you know, is New York's dying as a creative scene? And the Times article was a few years ago was making, oh no, it's more creative than ever, but it's just now people are having, you know, speakeasies inside water towers, like and like kind of saying that the new space, creative space, was these kind of pop-up temporary things, which left me very unconvinced. You know, that looked to me making way too much of a virtue out of necessity and kind of desperate in a way. So, I mean, do you agree that the new frontier is these kind of interstitial kind of projects, or is that giving up too much?
Well, I think the other kind of point Lake was making, which I really relate to, is the idea that big is not always the most important thing. That it's really, whether it was the stoop, whether it's a phone booth that gets repurposed, whether it's a storefront where it's a lobby you feel welcome in, whether it's a kind of corner drugstore that someone put a bench outside where you, that's really the kind of, you know, lifeblood of this discussion. That some of the big mega things are in a way not as vital or as important as the kind of that actual everyday activity of public spaceness.
Right. In that sense, you know, we can talk all we want about the Heatherwick thing, because we're going to kind of see it unfolding in front of our eyes. But at the same time, you can always just not go there. Sure, it's still a big part of a big chunk of the city that it's being affected by it, but I'm equally more interested in kind of what happens at a smaller scale, because that's where the difference matters in the end. And I think at one point I realized, in a rather frustrating manner, I guess, that, you know, when you go down the street, or actually in a building too, but especially on the street, every corner that you see, everything that you see there was done by someone, was touched by hand, means money and hopefully some thought, more or less thought, went into it, which is both frustrating and exciting, right? Frustrating because, wow, this could have been done so much better. And then exciting became, wait, that means there is opportunity to operate at different scales and to cause change at very subtle levels. And I think at the end of the day, you know, it's easier to have discussion at these kind of grand public gestures, but it's still in the street, it's still in the details where life happens.
I got to ask you guys, in fact, I'll ask Damon this. So you know that apparently that now that New York City is only going to have red, you know, the tactile paving things, they're all going to be red. Is that good or bad? That somehow that really shook me, that whole thing. And like just
Really?
that idea, because New York used to be much more of a created individual decision. Certain things like curbs are those kinds of New York, you know, cast iron curbs, but there was like, you could see the randomness of some decision making, which we have that other tendency, which is to make things really uniform.
Although then you take it even further and you museumize what once was maybe spontaneous, like the incrustations on those poles, right, in Astor Place. You know, for me, you know, and I think for our work at Hector, the real opportunity, you know, around designing a public space, whether it's small or big or what have you, is the opportunity to have it really mean something. And I think that rather than maybe the way that I was mostly taught in architecture school, in excellent schools, to be able to explain and justify an architectural notion, right, to have like a concept, you know, like the oculus, that I could somehow roll up into the place and like unfurl like a beautiful, you know, like a peacock putting up my tail, and people would be like, damn, like that's it. Like instead of really trying to operate like that, I think what has been a lot more interesting and a lot more successful is about how you're gonna put the little piece that you have the chance to work on, right? That little piece of curb, you know, that little piece of grass, or, you know, even if it's a couple acres or what have you. And how that's going to fit into the way that people in a place, you know, coming and going as they do, understand what that place means, right? Because I have a friend named Ana Baptista, who's an amazing professor who works and studies in environmental justice, which I hope is a phrase everyone's heard before. And she is really, she called me up the other day and she wants to do this panel, and she's like, yeah, everyone around me is talking about green gentrification, right? Where basically a public space or an amenity or some nice thing, you know, is used as a weapon, right? Whether it's changing a neighborhood or signaling that a formerly, you know, stigmatized area is now open for investment, right? You know, I had an amazing experience in New Orleans. You guys heard of parklets before, right? Everyone like knows and those parklets. When I was in New Orleans, they told me about the genocidal parklets. And I was like blown away about this, you know, and it was about a creative placemaking proposal for a certain neighborhood and how people understood the meaning of that in terms of who was proposing it, who was given the money, whose names were on the application, who was gonna get paid off of it, right? And so I feel like the opportunity to design a public space is about like learning as well as you can, like having your jacket pulled, and then trying to figure out as a designer how those things can be like woven together in a different way, right? And it might not look the way, you know, like I've had some of the staunchest allies who are like, you better be using like the historic light poles, you know, and no, I'm not gonna use the historic light poles. But hopefully whatever does get used is something that is recognizable at this other level, right? That connects to this deeper, much more complicated world of how we as humans live and talk and describe things. Is that okay, Claire?
Did you get what you wanted?
I still don't know if Damon thinks that all tactile paving,
Oh, right.
should be
Are you talking
red
about
or
the
not.
truncated cones? The truncated
Yes,
cones?
the
Right, that
truncated
only
cones.
became legally required, right, in the 80s.
Yeah, for basically ADA access, but if you're blind. But now they all have to be red.
Yeah, well, we shouldn't get us started on some like dust-ups with traffic engineering stories, right? That would really take this panel south.
Okay, well, let's talk about. We could save the tactile paving, the really deep tactile paving debate for the drinks afterwards. But let's talk about art then, and public art, and where you see it fitting into this conversation in an evolving way. And maybe start with you've done so much public art.
When I get a particular commission, it involves sort of going to the community and learning a little bit about the history. It's always interesting, seeing a little bit, as an artist, I kind of like go down there and do my thing, right? And I do a number of community engagements and try and get a sense of, who this project is serving, who lives in this community, learn a little bit about the history. And it kind of makes me think of your kind of earlier point about you can't really like put everybody's thing into the pot. You know what I mean? At a certain point, you need to like start editing out certain things. And it's just very interesting to see just the dynamic between where the money comes from, who's on the particular board. You know what I mean? Just there's an incredible amount of kind of political machinations that occur before the artist is even kind of opened up and invited. But I guess that's neither here nor there. As I mentioned, things like the swing space, just very kind of, looking at kind of different opportunities for where art can be, and to your point about the thing you mentioned, which is like, I like that quote, virtue, what is it, virtue is a necessity, or virtue, what is it? Making a virtue of necessity. Yeah, exactly. So if it becomes kind of an either or, so if it becomes a kind of either or thing, right, then that definitely becomes a problem. If the narrative is we just can't compete with, the large projects and how they're transforming our neighborhood, we got to go underground, guerrilla art warfare with it, then that's absolutely kind of a problem. But if it's more about sort of diversifying your art stock options, where they go, you know what I mean? Where we put public art, what we consider public art. I'm doing a project with MTA now. They recently just started getting a lot of money to put art in the subway, and they got a lot of problems, which is, which we know this is New York.
Something to look at while you're waiting for
exactly, but and so when I just really think about these things, and I think about, before I started doing public art, my kind of only sort of active awareness of public art was just the sculptures that you see in front of banks, and I wasn't thinking about library. I wasn't thinking about so many different opportunities for where public art is. So for me, it's just continuing to kind of continue that conversation. You talked about the artwork light pole. There was an artist, Jason Shellowitz, Jay Shelley. He did this thing where he took like rap quotes and then he made street signs and he put them up in the neighborhood that the quotes would reference. You know what I mean? So there's many different ways to come at it. And like for something like that, for the community there, then that was something that kind of appealed to sort of like kind of representation. You know what I mean? Looking at street signs, which
is that a guerrilla project, or did he?
It was a guerrilla project, yeah. But just looking at the ways in which you can approach public art, if you consider that what is public is far more expansive than needing to get a grant or an endowment and funding from a particular, you know what I mean? If you kind of really expand what that is, I mean the whole thing with the MTA. It's it's also something that oftentimes, like you mentioned, these things have a kind of slow burn where people appreciate them over time. Because of how we're conditioned to think about public space, a lot of times you don't think that this space can be, you know, transformed or valued in a particular way, and you don't even consider that something should happen here until it happens. And then it's like, oh, wow, that's really cool. That's really awesome. Now my lunch break is a whole lot better. You know what I mean? Now my commute is a whole lot better. Now the way I engage, you know, like now I'm seeing much more of kind of a space that I occupy, and I kind of have been operating within more like a sort of drone from getting from point A to point B. That's kind of how I think about where art can then kind of sort of collaborate with all different kinds of disciplines, like the DOT, you know, their barrier beautification project, you know, like all of those kind of things, you know. For me is where it's very interesting.
I mean, the reason I asked about whether it was a guerrilla gesture or not is because it does seem to me a lot of the conversation about public art and public space it has to do with, yeah, like particularly conversations around gentrification and so on. The art becomes like this symbol of like that no one consulted us about this thing, or it just the kind of and even, you know, sometimes there's you know, I'm really have a mixed feeling about the relationship of art to these conversations, because on the one hand, sometimes even a good artistic project is a way to like soften. You know, it's like, let's have a nice symbolic gesture, so you can look at that over here while we're doing this over here.
But if you look at it broadly in aggregate, like no one consulted anyone about what the top of the Chrysler building should look like, right? No one, like, I think the sort of activist where artists, architects, developers, politicians, planners, that I think the issue is like a kind of more active engagement with the city. That kind of ferment results in so many different kinds of, I would call it moments of art, like poetry. Like my life changed when Poetry in Motion in the subways. I just, for some reason, that program totally got to me. Like I just like, there's not that, because I'm not particularly an avid poetry, but whoever selected those, they just got to me. But at the same time, I'm so glad that I don't have to kind of like I look at certain buildings and think, thank God no one was asked. You know, whoever, like they just spent enough time in the city, they watched the way sun fell, they just had an idea. And I think it's important also to bring, for people to, artists in particular, to bring ideas to the table.
Sure, you get that, and you also get the endless stairway or whatever thing.
You know, there's price to be paid.
Right, but I think my favorite probably New York public art moments are the informal ones, and definitely not the prescribed or paid for ones. And they always make me think, wow, someone took the time and actually did that. Like there's that picture of David Bowie that's kind of cut up and put on a fence, and you only see it when you pass by. It's on Bond Street, between Lafayette and Bowery, I think. No, that doesn't make sense, but next to Lafayette. Or you know, graffiti sometimes, or just some writing somewhere. And I do think it's important that a city is able to be a canvas for this kind of informal, accidental type of situations, because if we're always just relying on some super structured hierarchy and 100 decisions for everything to align magically, it's rare that it's ever going to happen. It happens sometimes, but not always. And one of my favorite probably guerrilla moments, for that matter, was 5 years ago when it was Kanye West was about to launch his new album Yeezus, and his first single came out. It was called New Slaves. And he did this thing. I was working with him on the time on different projects, but I did not know about this. So all of a sudden your phone just kind of starts getting off, because these trucks in I don't know how many cities around the States, I think actually around the world, were basically going through the city and stopping in certain parking spots and projecting the video onto buildings. And all of a sudden you just had these people, kids, just running through the city trying to find a truck and just watching that video and kind of dancing to it. And I'm pretty sure it wasn't kind of done with the city by any means, but it was just simple and beautiful, and we can have a discussion around the safety and the risk of something like that. But moments like that are important. It is important that a city allows for informal things and guerrilla things to happen. I think, I think that's the role, if anything, of public space, to encourage those kind of moments.
Although I'm not mad about artists getting paid either, I would say.
No, by all means.
And I would be so curious, like once the MTA project wraps and you're like free to talk about it, to kind of to reconnect and to hear like how that went, because those systems, I mean, I think they have all these risks of making like boring work and get us an artist who works in bronze, right? But the fact that there are people inside these lumbering bureaucracies, whether they're working in the city's Percent for Art program, who are trying to figure out how to make them work, and sometimes I think doing a good job, and sometimes maybe missing a little bit. But I think that they only start to get where we need to be, and I think for us as designers, that is a real challenge. Even the most top shelf of design firms like SOM, right? I think operates in a larger field, right, in terms of where work comes from and the kinds of tasks to which design is asked to be applied, right? Like, what are we, making euphemisms for? Oftentimes us as urban planners and architects have been like the chief euphemism creators of quite violent actions, right? If people have heard about something that was called urban renewal, like you'll know, what I'm talking about. So, for me, even as we might look at these kind of massive, difficult issues, some of the real solutions are in that day-to-day grind of like, well, how did the MTA person like start this conversation? And like, what was the contract looking like? And how was it set up? And how were the lines drawn that actually then will result in this piece of the city that tons of us will walk by and, our days will be wonderfully brightened by?
I just want to add one small thing. I'm all for paid art, by the way. But I do feel oftentimes clients approach architect with an attitude where, like, we actually don't want to touch on critical subjects. But then they do, buy an art piece or hire an artist and give them free kind of reign to go as political or as charged as they want. So in that sense, art is really important.
The art is literally the quarantine space for the political discussion.
And as an architect, they're like, don't touch on it. Don't be critical. No touchy subjects. But then let's have a piece of art here which can do anything. So
are you thinking of one thing?
Sorry?
Are you thinking of one?
Well, I'm dealing with that right now. We can have a conversation after. Give me a week.
Well, I mean, I guess I
have
please.
one thing to add to that. So a number of years ago, we collaborated with Socrates and Noguchi Museum to kind of put artists in the position of being the planners, and then they could choose any architect they wanted to collaborate with, and it got sort of, and for me that was revelatory and really interesting, because I think artists have a lot to contribute to the discussion before things are things, and yet they themselves are like, oh, you don't want me to make a thing, like, and so it was not an easy process, but I think it was a really good process. I mean, it was, and people didn't do the same things. Natalie German-Jaco did not do what Rick did and not do what Mary Miss did, but they raised important issues in a way that it's like they asked different questions. And I think that would be really cool if there was more of that happening before it turned into the sacrificial thing that you're not allowed to kind of be in dialogue with.
My question was just, it just seems like we're grasping towards this kind of middle, like there's this public art as spontaneity, it's like it's just what happens in the kind of molecular level, and then there's this also planned project making, which can be really invigorating, like allows you to think transformatively about spaces, but it can also be really constricting in the sense that it imposes a vision. So I mean, I'm just trying to get what's the middle, how do you mediate those two things? Like, how do you plan for the spontaneity?
Well, I think I can think of a couple of art pieces which were doing that, like for Crystal's Gates, or the Public Art Fund did one at one point. I can't remember the the artist's name, but you basically were putting headphones on and she was walking you through Central Park or even the Columbus Circle. That there are art pieces that just help you, that encourage you to explore things and look at the city in a different way. This probably doesn't answer your question again. Sorry, I keep saying that. Kind of made it a rule. But I do think there is a role there for art to help you, just look at the city differently in a critical way, and where the art piece isn't just about itself, but it's about giving you a platform to explore things. Maybe that's where things can meet.
We had a really good collaboration that way on the Democracy Project with Creative Time, where we were trying to figure out what Brooklyn Army Terminal meant to people, and it was one of those, why don't we call Creative Time and just have them come look at it? And they were like, we're working with Pedro Reyes and we're thinking about Washington, D.C., but now that we see this and this election is coming up, what about here? And then it became a whole discussion about like, what were these army facilities? And so I feel like it then allowed a lot of people. Did anyone here go to Democracy at all? Okay, then don't you think it allowed people to go, what the hell is this place and what is happening right now, in a way that could never happen if it was necessarily a permanent art piece, I think.
One way to approach, I think, the question is how you structure the program from the jump. So in a city where we were working, a bunch of very nice and smart and very fancy art people had really wanted to make like a very fancy sculpture for a long time. And they'd been trying to raise like a lot of money, like millions of dollars to do this. And they had never gotten there. And so this money had sat in this account for a long time. And so we were like, all right, we know that there's like been a lot of talk about, wouldn't it be great if there was some kind of public art program, like Philly's mural program is oftentimes referenced. And they didn't have much money, and so there wasn't going to be more than painting involved. But the way that we tried to set it up was that the projects would grow from organized communities in the town. And what that hit was really just the way that the application process went. So the very first thing that happened was that rather than ask an artist to send in their JPEGs or or like surveying like best contemporary practices or calling NATO at Creative Time when he was there. Yeah, he was, and what we did was say, hey, do you have a crew or a group that you're with, whether it's your mosque or your church or your block club or your neighborhood association? And is there some wall in your neighborhood where at least you know the owner, or maybe it's a public wall, and transforming that wall into some kind of artwork would mean it was something that later on you all could point at and be like, yeah, we did that, and now we're going to do this, right? So it fit into a larger set of goals and ambitions in terms of building the power of the neighborhood. And after we did that, we built up a portfolio, and there were actually like people there who were paid to be neighborhood researchers and kind of like knowledge subject matter experts. And only then did we bring the artists in, right? No surprise, the artists were pissed because what they wanted to be in a situation is when they were able to propose their wonderful and beautiful idea and then have it be celebrated and implemented without much discussion probably. So it wasn't for every kind of artist, and we learned that, and we learned how to get better at communicating that around the program as we went forward. And I wouldn't say that's how everything necessarily should be done, but in this one case, it, I think, had some amazing results.
And I love that example because, is my mic on? Can't tell. Yeah. All right, sorry. No, I like that example because that's kind of what I was referring to, right? So there's a kind of polarized, looking at the guerrilla art and then the sort of large, major, huge project. And so that's actually what I was thinking. You know what I mean? Just we're sort of at the very early phase. Not like it's necessarily a kind of movement, but you know what I mean? But just thinking about literally what are the opportunities and what are the ways to do it. How do you challenge the kind of model for how public art has been, funded, and how you've gone to find, artists and applicants and where, the sites for public art is. So the way I'm thinking about it is actually, proposing test models, working through test models, seeing if it works, understanding that it works for some and it doesn't work for others, right? Kind of like a sort of way to slowly sort of change the dialogue and the perception, right, of how public art is perceived of and what is public art, right? and how it engages with the community, the sort of different ways in which, one can approach a community from, your end. It's sort of operated in the complete opposite way that it kind of happens now, right? So yeah, I mean, it's just interesting for me to see, which is why I brought up the kind of swing space model, because that was something that I just had never really kind of thought about. You know what I mean? If you've been in any kind of urban space like New York for a very long time, you accept these spaces. You accept the kind of bleakness of certain areas. You accept, like you begin to accept these things, and you don't even think about it. Just a sidebar, I remember being in a city being like, wow, this is a dirty city, until I got back to New York, and I'm like, this is the dirtiest city. And the reason why I thought that way is because, in Europe, outside of the U.S. in New York, cities are cleaner. And then when I saw one which was almost as dirty as New York, I was like, whoa, didn't expect this. And then I got back to my neighborhood, and I was like, no, this is really, especially the snow had just melted, and everyone treats the snow as like garbage, right? They're kind of like moral opposition to throwing litter directly in the street is like, it's a pile of snow. If I put it in this snow, it's not littering. No one sees it.
Sculpture.
So
Temporary public art.
Exactly. So, when that snow melts, you see almost like a collection of the wintertime detritus.
So we've been talking for a little more than an hour, and I want to give the folks a chance to weigh in or have a question for people. Well, if there are questions already, then we'll just cut straight to questions. Yeah.
Sure, I'll try to talk loud enough so you can hear me. Sorry to yell over here. It seems to me that one of the tensions with public space is the tension between it being sort of a respite from the city and the idea of it being a place of commerce. We were talking about historically the role of public spaces, and many of them started out as actually the places for public markets. They had a very commercial function as their sort of the way they were started. And, I'm thinking not just here in the United States, but all over the world. And then maybe in the 20th century, there was a sense that we should separate things. Like we should have commercial over here, open space there, and residential over there. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, since we're talking about the future of public space. Can we kind of get that balance back between being okay with the idea of people selling things in public parks and public squares, and that not being somehow, debasing public parks?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think about, a lot of my kind of speculative architectural fictions that I create look at informal settlements, right? And look at informal commerce and how that happens all over the world, here as well. If you've been in Harlem, you've seen 125th Street completely transform. And that kind of becomes a sort of function of like big capitalism, right? Can it happen, in a space, in spaces like New York City, where you see it happen all over the world, because it's just there's an informal economy that exists alongside a major global economy, and it's been so much kind of like, it's been a part of that community for so long, And what happens to places like 125th Street, where you do have this sort of like market and people selling, well then, when a developer buys a certain plot, you know what I mean? Like, so that is what has kind of transformed the ability for that to really occur. And so now it has to be a sort of curated space. And now, development does function in terms of viewing the individual as a consumer, but in a very particular way. You know what I mean? That is not this kind of, wonderful informal barter system. And that is one of the major aspects of, how these things that were historically apart, but when the kind of economy and kind of like the sort of governing structure transforms and is focused more on kind of big businesses, it's almost not really a possibility anymore, except in spaces where people just do it until the police come along and charge you for it. You know what I mean? Until, it's the way looking at Canal Street, you know, and people selling bags and stuff like that, which was part of New York's culture. But then all of a sudden, you know, yeah, it's kind of, yeah. I'm like, I don't know. It's can it happen? I don't, you know.
If people like selling things in the street, I was just going to say they should look up the Street Vendor Project, which is basically a labor union of street vendors. So.
I was just going to say they're still selling weed on one corner of Washington Square Park, which makes me strangely happy because it wasn't completely cleaned up, but I'm pretty sure that's not what you were referring to. But I completely agree with you. I think that sense of that kind of informal type of businesses where it's not just whatever a cart that's being shipped in the morning that you know is part of a bigger, basically, corporation at the end of the day is important. I mean, again, to me, the public space at its best, it's a platform and infrastructure for a multitude of different activities to be happening, including the commercial one. I don't think this should be understood as commerce is bad or selling things is bad by any means. And you know, you do need also things to keep to keep kind of the life of certain areas alive. Sorry. What I mean by that, or what I was thinking about, I really love Central Park, especially since I moved up to Harlem, because I got to know a very different side of it. Like there's the dog walking community, there's the runners, there's all these different pockets. But all the way, I think, above, I'm not even sure if south of the reservoir, but north of the reservoir, you do have public toilets, by the way, which is great. But you never have vendors, right? They're all downtown, all where it's super busy, and that's rather unfortunate because there is a really beautiful, like it's really hard to actually just go get a bottle of water or something. And it's really unfortunate because there is an entire kind of community and ecosystem of activities happening on Memorial Day or certain weekends in summer. People go at 7 a.m. and kind of pick their picnic spot and put their barbecues there. And you know, those things should be as much encouraged as the kind of tourists walking at the southern end of the park.
Okay, we have a couple of questions now, so we'll start back there.
So I'm an artist and filmmaker. I've only been in New York for 2 years, and since I've been here, I've been mostly interested in the relationship of technology to the city. Something I didn't get too much into, but like since I've been here, we've had the Pokemon Go moment, which was a big, disparate, decentralized public art movement. And if you really think about it, and then we have the concept that a lot of people, especially my generation, are drawn to, a more decentralized spectrum of public spaces because of social media. So like, what do you see as the relevance and role of like, virtual space and virtual personas within public spaces?
I think it's more decentralized. I tend to think that it re-centralizes public space around viral objects.
Yeah, some of them, but then also, you know, they'll take people to places like, I didn't know what the Bushwick Collective was when I first got here, and I went out there because there were just not enough people wanted to go take pictures in front of it and stuff, and so you can, you know, pop up a piece of art anywhere, and a lot of people seem to want to go there just for proof that they've been there via social media, you know. Is that like a relevant factor in the conversation of public space?
Stunting is always a factor.
Well, I think there's different sides that come with the kind of virtual activity. There's that idea of connecting, right, of virtual crowds. There's, of course, the kind of competition of experience that we're all kind of participating in on Instagram. There's different sides. And one of the interesting ones that we didn't touch on at all, I think one of the things that many clients come to us with is they want to recreate basically what I can call just a Ace lobby, in essence. And that to me is actually the most kind of quintessential 21st century public space because that's everywhere where basically we all just hang out on our phones or laptops, but we do it together because somehow we feel like it's more okay to do it there amongst others than do it at home where it feels potentially more pathetic. Just saying. But I do find those kind of hotel lobbies very interesting, and I think historically they also, different moment in time, they played various roles, but that is an interesting moment where I think the fact that we spend so much time with our virtual crowd makes almost the need of being in a space more important. And I think that's where public space can come in again. Even if you don't necessarily interact, I think just that connection with humans, just seeing people, just, you know, kind of being surrounded by people becomes super important. On the other hand, crowdfunding, I think, is super important. I was wondering earlier if there's a good example of a public art piece that was crowdfunded that came from there. If you're familiar with the Plus Pool, it wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for crowdfunding, and hopefully we're all going to be able to experience it pretty soon. But you know, obviously social media and the virtual world is changing the world we're interacting, and I think we have yet to properly test out or to understand really ways in which that affects it as a bigger picture. But I do think there's a lot of potential and exciting things to come from there. Can you?
For me, I would say for me the biggest technological boost has been essentially city bike and cycling, and then all of the, you know, whether it's Apple Watch, the watches people have, which means that, you know, I can get online and see a bicycle heat map of where people are in the city, and like just from a perspective of changing, like bicycles actually are better for stores and restaurants, and it gives a different scale to a neighborhood. I think really the bicycle, and then connecting the bicycle to a network where you know where this bike is and stuff, and it's all over the boroughs now, it in a lot of ways has had a more meaningful effect on public space. And some of the programs you're talking about, people jump on a city bike to connect. It's really, to me, mobility and technology together are the big driver right now, and hoping that the privatization of that, I think a big issue is like, do we have to wait for corporations to supply this? There's a lot of stuff out there on people creating their own networks. I think that's super interesting.
Well, it's actually, when I moved to New York in 2004, you know, people were getting arrested for public, as it was like a political cause, you know. Yeah. There's still people going through the system who got like, you know, fought for like public biking, and then it's a Citibank branded thing. And I think the first city bikes are actually
and e-bikes
these kind of
now, right? This was a crime, and now it looks like we may be into e-bikes.
They're right here. Yeah.
I also just moved from Europe to New York about a year ago, so I found a lot of the talking that you've done kind of like reflecting my idea between the States and Europe. And what I noticed, the comment on the stoop, and I kind of like start reflecting on the lack of porosity that public space has in the United States, and also the fact that I moved to a city like New York, and the thing I noticed that like the parks, which are probably the main public space for New York, just close at dusk. And I was like, I went to the Biennale 2 years ago of architecture. There was a project about Medellin in Colombia where they did the research and they found out that the places with the highest crime rate was actually the old water tanks. And what they've done, they have redesigned the water tanks as major public space, and they become the safest place in probably the city with the highest crime rate in South America. So I'm asking myself, for the future of public space, when the public space in New York or in big cities or in America will stop being protected and will become protecting the city? When will be the public space available for safety?
I think it's a two-way street, actually. It's a very good issue that you're bringing up. And what I mean by that is, I think it was Joan Didion writing about Central Park, and she made the point that, for example, Central Park officially closes at night, but you can obviously still walk in. You just don't want to be caught by the one guy driving around. But she made the point that places like Central Park are not supposed to be safe at night. And I thought it was an interesting observation. I love Central Park, and part of its beauty lies in the fact that it has underpasses and bridge and kind of hidden nooks and crooks where you feel you're still in the city, but you can be alone and intimate. And had safety been the primary and only concern and driver, you might end up with a kind of giant soccer field or something along those lines. I do think, by all means, security and safety is important, but I think it shouldn't be fetishized in a way, or it shouldn't be the only kind of driver. So Central Park is perfectly safe during the day, right? And they're taking the measure for it, just not at night. That being said, I think what to me just trivia, random, last thing I'm going to say to the subject. One of the most amazing experiences in New York in a public space was actually around probably 2 a.m. Being on the Great Lawn and being surrounded by the darkness of Central Park and seeing the city by its, by your feet. You do it on your own risk, by all means. It is a dark, hidden space, and but it was. I can only recommend it.
No, yeah. So I'm sorry if I'm just. My question wasn't clear on like safety as I cannot walk there and be killed. What I'm asking is, there is what I notice a clear cut between what's public and what's private. Like in Europe, I study in the Netherlands, we have no problem in entering like a lobby or something. Here, I always have to feel that I have to ask. So what you were saying about the stoop, that it's kind of this private element who blends, it creates porosity between public and private. Could that be the future of public space in a city that clear cuts public and private so much?
I mean, the best I can say is that the public space in any city is a reflection of its society, right? And the kind of its history too. And I think what you're bringing up is a very good point.
I mean, during Occupy Wall Street, we had a lot of difficulty finding public spaces to meet, right? And ended up these POPs, privately owned public spaces ended up being like a major major venue for public meeting. Probably have time for like one or two more questions, and then I throw it back to these folks up here.
Several of you have mentioned community engagement as you embark on a project. You speak a little louder. I was saying that several of you talked about community engagement as you start a project, and I think you alluded to a necessity to kind of filter out the amalgam of ideas that come across in those meetings. So my question is, how do you go about choosing which ones get to stay and which ones have to go? Because ultimately, I would expect you can't program everything in the same place.
Well, there's a really great history, especially in like urban planning writing, where people are like having real, grappling with this. There's an essay that I think it's assigned almost like in every planning class that I ever visit, by a woman named Sherry Arnstein, who was working for HUD in the late 60s, soon after it was created. And I don't know if anyone here remembers the war, this thing called the War on Poverty. But one of the ideals that was written into the law was that all of these programs must have the maximum feasible participation of the people for whom they were designed. This didn't go in a straight line, or good or bad. For example, the late Senator Moynihan wrote a book called Maximum Feasible Misunderstanding, which is a great explication of it. But all of these people, and Sherry Arnstein wrote this essay after kind of resigning in disgust called The Ladder of Citizen Participation, where she says, look, just talking about this as like a one thing only, like really doesn't fit the bill, right? It doesn't fit the bill when it comes to the details of design, and it certainly doesn't fit the bill when it comes to the details of politics and power. And so the people that won the right, really only 50 years ago, that when people were making decisions about how to build things, that there would be any kind of process at all, like we stand on their shoulders, right? Now there are these required things like public hearings, et cetera, community board meetings. You can knock yourself out. But the real challenge I think that comes down to us is the quality of that participation, right? And I would even say, as a thought experiment, whenever you want to say community engagement or community participation, why don't you say community organizing, right? And think back to someone like Saul Alinsky or many others, Ella Baker in the American tradition, called community organizing, right? That really thought about the reason you're getting people together is not to have a great collection of ideas, although that can be one, I think, secondary or further down the list kind of benefit. The reason you're getting people together is to have power, right? To make things happen. In the case of Facebook, it's to make a lot of money, right? We're talking about social media and technology, a little bit about that in the news now. So I think that when it comes down to these questions about design, about the gate, about how late it's open, which has been a sea change since the 80s from what I understand, in New York City parks where there weren't gates. We all are living in a serious post-Rudy Giuliani New York City. And you also don't have to look very far, right, to people, say in Black Lives Matter movement, to say what has been the price of securing the kind of New York City that we have today, right? It's in bodies, it's in blood. So that's like deep and extreme, but it's real, right? These kinds of issues, and I think that's why maybe there's so many people here today on something that maybe seems as tired as public space, right? When you're as old as I am, you're like, really, more public space talk? But with Claire, it's like, yes, because unless people come together, right, then we cannot do that process of community organizing. And I don't know what would bring people together in this room around anything that we've talked about tonight. That'd be interesting, survey monkey or whatever to do. But I feel like that's got to be the heart of it.
Anything else on that before I turn it over to the last question?
No, I just want to say that's a very good point when you made a distinction between community engagement and community organizing, because community engagement definitely is a kind of performance in a sense. You know what I mean? When I've gone and I don't really have to do anything anyone tells me to do. You know what I mean? The idea is to kind of, I get to know them, they get to know me, they snap a lot of pictures, you know what I mean? So really making that distinction, I thought that was a very good point. And the idea behind power and access. That wasn't necessarily your question, which was kind of more like, how do you? But I think challenging the whole way you look at the way we think of community engagement is a start to make that a more meaningful, as opposed to, like I said, a performance, So, good point.
No, I'm good.
No. Okay, and last question back there.
I was just hoping everybody could talk about loitering for a brief moment.
Loitering?
Loitering.
Loitering.
Oh my God. Can you expand on what you want us to say about loitering? I'm really pro never using that word, but actually doing the action, which is, I call it stickiness. I think it's a successful place when more people want to hang out, and if we could get any rule about loitering being a crime off the books, I would be pro. And I feel the same way about skateboarding. As in, what I think kind of just in reflection that, again, it's sort of like, how do we make arguments for why investments in spaces we share are worth it? I think multi-purpose uses for it and having more people want to use it are usually a good indicator of success. But if you install rules that artificially tell certain people they shouldn't be there versus others, then you're starting to skew what actually the reading of the space is.
Yeah, and that's interesting. You can't, like when I think of loitering, I'm like, same way you pro not using it, because of course you simply can't disentangle that word at all from race or class. You know what I mean? Loitering has always distinctly been these black folks are loitering. There's more than 3 of you. You know what I mean? Like my experience throughout my life of walking through a mall, like if there's more than 3 black people, it's a problematic thing. So loitering like that, until you can, these things are not, they're like part of a very clear system, right? So until, so it is purported to be this kind of completely unbiased system, but it's literally the exact opposite. So until you can actually, really separate those things, and kind of define things in a particular way in which it sort of looks at everybody, sort of in the same way, then like certain terms will always only kind of mean one thing to a certain person, and it's kind of impossible to discuss it in any other way. So yeah, that's my thing when I think about loitering. I'm like, like loitering can get you killed, for real.
Shout out to this project that artist Chat Treviso just launched called Yes Loitering.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's cool.
UrbanOmnibus.com.
Just on a quick design, does anyone know Louise Nevelson Plaza? Near the, kind of right near Chase Plaza, giant Louise Nevelson sculptures, art, major art. Well, it used to be this place where everyone came to play chess and checkers downtown, full of people. So it got redesigned post 9/11. You don't see anyone in there. And it's beautiful design, but is it, I think what all those people were doing when they were playing chess and checkers, they were loitering actually. But I guess we decided it's not good for people to hang out and play games underneath art anymore. But.
Well, on that note, I think we will call it a day, and we will go do some loitering ourselves outside in our less public space. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, SOM. Thank you to all of you for coming out tonight.